Hey, what's up? I'm just making a video, and here's a clever one. Have you ever seen a video of feet talking? You actually might not you might not that might be original, but actually it might be deep. But all I meant to say is we gotta sometimes do things different. But if you observe the way this video, now you listen, that's what I wanted to talk about. So right now, I'm I was I wanted to point out that you hear those birds singing like that, and that is actually I heard that this morning when I was doing the errand, and I wanted to talk about that that birds that what the birds are doing right there as you hear the video. Now, it's kind of interesting where a lot of things when you say original things like whether on the online, I think maybe on online like YouTube now there's a little bit more freedom to express thoughts and then even maybe borrow and collaborate with things that are being said or have been said in the past. But going back before we had the same communication apparatus and also access to different learning venues and sources of learning like say books and print, there's been different access to print different at different periods, and that's changed a lot even to the very day within the last 5, 10, or maybe at least 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That's changed a lot, and it's also changed the meaning of higher education with access to those learning resources and materials. But the need to cite sources has been different at different times. But a lot of people wouldn't. If I say something that might be that I would think of original, and you don't have either a source or a or authority, which would be normally you curate authority by going through different credentialing venues where you make like a thesis, which is like you go through a lot of learning of like answering tests and doing papers and stuff like that, and then in like a lower level, and then you get to a higher tier where now you are doing you're doing different higher scope of research, but also maybe higher scope of analytics. And then with that, but what's significant is what you have to say that is original, and actually the more refined and potent is actually the more significant in the form of like a thesis. And then you do your research to support and defend that thesis, and you present that thesis to other people who have been through a similar vetting and credentialing process. And by you defending your thesis and having something original to say, but also supporting that with your research and also your scholarship and your writing, now you are in that scope of that field, worthy to stand with those people who operate that way, and maybe you can conduct different learning or further research or publishing from that standpoint. But you're more so you're only within the scope of that authority so long as you continue to publish and furnish original thought in the truest essence. According to people like Tashreeq Bey, he said there's no title of any kind without like publishing or like working in that field and defending that. So you need to constantly be publishing, and that was so daunting for my father. When my father was an upstart, they call it adjunct, non-tenured. That means non-guaranteed contract over time professor, where he was inundated with the coursework of his own students, which was a large workload. But then also he had to assume the workload of some of his peers who either failed or chose not to attend some of their own courses. Then he had to attend endless meetings, which were a little bit more of a ritual and formality. According to another academic, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the politics and dynamics of meetings are somewhat ritualistic and an end into itself and a reality in itself. But then you compound that with the rigors, the challenges of just communication and logistics in something as with as much finance, but also room for different perspectives between different ranks, from students to families to community members to educators, to publishing venues in an institution. And you can imagine how much is going on inside of those meetings in higher education. Then on top of that, my father was expected to travel to different conferences and publish at the same time. Now that I'm older, I can appreciate what was on his plate, including having a family, a small family. And he struggled with some substance at that time, and I can actually appreciate what he was under now that I'm a little bit older. But what I meant to say is that even at that time and into the present day, most people are not convinced unless you are borrowing from sources, operating with authority, and then further making original statements that are yet contingent upon sources but they're not to be plagiarizing those sources. So it's a little bit of an ambivalence there, where you're prompting people to derive insight from sources, yet you are punishing them for relying or presenting those as their own, which I think a lot of insight is really it's collaboration. So it's almost like a fine art to collaborate, that is research, but then also to offer original insight. There's a fine line to that, and it might have to do with your spirit and intent. And sometimes my father would approach books differently then and now than I do, where he really goes for quotes, and he'll go through a book for a specific reason, looking for a specific thing from that book that will support a broader message that he's going for. And that I more so indulge in books and enjoy books and get the essence and knack of a book, and then it's more simple for me to respectfully reference that. But I think there might be strengths in different ways, and maybe he goes through more content like that. But he's still much of a researcher to this day. He can't help it because that's who he is. But all I meant to say is that a lot of things are not strong unless you have evidence to support it. So maybe we could say a source is evidence, and those birds are the evidence of what I'm talking about. You hear the way they were singing like that. Now it's very beautiful, sophisticated, par excellence. But also it's influential, because as you hear a bird like that, sound like that, that's sophisticated, that nuanced, that sharp, that's clear, that intentional. Sometimes, you talk about, so there's an eloquence in vernacular, like slang. Slang is like, according to a book on poetry I'm reading, slang can be considered as a form of metaphor, and that book says that metaphor may be an engine of language, is where our words come from, are basically metaphors describing one thing as another thing. And I'll put that book in the description, just because I quoted that directly. But so there's eloquence in like idioms, that's like things that you can't understand unless you're from a background or a culture, or it's just words that don't make sense on the surface. The YouTuber Kaiju Kong, that is Wayfinder, also known as Wayfinder, has said that the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is an example of an idiom, which is that doesn't make sense on the surface, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but it refers to masters in learned people, adepts in plain sight, that are concealed by their very ordinariness. That's an example. But a lot of language is actually that. But all I meant to say is that, but then you also have proper language that is like formal language, and sometimes formal language can be very forceful. Like if you could imagine how like a technical musical piece that relies on like Western tonality according to traditional standards of tonality, like harmony, it's going to sound very forceful and convincing and harmonic, but that's not always necessarily the only and best way of achieving harmony. Some of the videos on my very channel are musical. I think they're harmonious, but they're not actually relying on that form of harmony. However, when I start the piece does start according to an etude, which is a practice lick, and you could say that because I'm borrowing from what sounds good from that standpoint, from that initiation into the harmony, into the music, it's still somewhat tonal because it's based on that. And so I'm not just simply picking up a guitar and making random things that sound cool at that point, but it's stemming from what had actually been tonal, or abiding within tonal practices, and then building upon that. So it has been initiated in that sense, just like a key of harmony is initiated in music. What I meant to say is that with that the birds like that is almost as forceful as it's as eloquent and forceful as both something that would be formal and informal in vernacular, but it's also influential, and you don't realize how that could affect you, how that could actually change, like just a very how you maneuver your hand when you're doing something important, when you're lifting something, when you're doing something very important, maybe creative, brilliant. And influence like that, it could be inspirational, but it could also be very distracting. A lot of us, we think that we actually, so that bird that's chirping, those birds, they may be less than 2 years of living on Earth, that particular bird that you're hearing. Yet when you hear that bird, it would sound almost more respectful, more sublime, more dignified, more adult, more mature than a human being running their mouth. Me, myself, having about near about 4 decades of living. So all I meant to say is that, so I got another one with this.